Hi, I'm live. I hope everything goes well today. I'm reading Joan Marshall Grant together with her husband Denis Kelsey, writing Many Lifetimes. Joan Marshall Grant used to write books about her farm memories, 7 books, and here is a study into how our past incarnations can affect our lives today. I am in chapter 1. And it is Joan speaking, farm memory, and I continue. I think the reason why Henry's question about the relationship between Haydn and Egyptian music caused me to tune in to Carola, a personality which until then I had not even glimpsed, rather than to Sekita, was that the sound of the harpsichord was the thread I was following while I was shifting level. A harpsichord has a closer affinity with the 16th century lute than with any stringed instrument which Sekita had heard. Sekita was not particularly musical, but a lute was associated with both the happy and the harsh period of Carola's lifetime, and for 15 years was her only means of survival. This session was also unique in my experience because I not only got the outline of Carola's story, but also her birth date and her surname. The significance of dates and surnames is usually so ephemeral that they are seldom registered on the permanent components of a personality. But to Carola, the date of her birth was important because it was this which caused her father to acknowledge her as his child. And being a bastard, she had no surname until she married. She remembered the calendar year of her death because Anna, trying to encourage her to live, so often said, "You are only 27 and far too young to die." The last chapter of Carola's life was dictated to Charles Beatty, with whom I eloped 2 months earlier, just before the outbreak of World War II. We were driving along a country road in Sussex when I suddenly had a hunch to shift level. So Charles stopped the car, and during the next 3 hours, lying on pine needles in a small wood, I dictated over 4,000 words. After sitting up most of the night to type them, we posted the manuscript off to Methuen the following morning. During the next 4 months, Charles was at the Staff College doing the short war course, on which everyone was trying to absorb so much condensed information that he and the other 4 members of his syndicate were glad that I could do their typing for them. Having no knowledge of military matters, I was surprised to find how easily I could understand problems which concerned moving troops from one sector to another and keeping them supplied at each stage with everything they needed. But I did not begin to discover the reason for this small expertise until in 1941, when Charles had been invalided out of the army and we were living on his family estate, Trellidon, in North Wales. I then began to record a life in which I had been the nomarch of the Oryx, nearly 1,000 years after Sekita. Egypt was then divided into 18 nomes, and the nomarch was comparable to the Lord Lieutenant of an English county, although his authority was much wider. My name was Ra'ab Hotep. The tombs of his family, as I have since learned, although I have not had a chance to visit them, are at Beni Hassan. As I remembered more about him, I realized why the work I had done while Charles was at the Staff College had seemed so familiar. Ra'ab Hotep had learned how to cope with very similar problems, for if he had failed to provide sufficient water carriers for a desert march, the men he led would have been halted even more finally than an army whose vehicles had run out of gasoline. And if the wooden hafts were the wrong diameter to fit the holes in the stone mace heads, this type of mace was flung rather than used as a club, it would have been as disconcerting as a contemporary commander found that the ammunition for his artillery was of the wrong caliber. During the last reign of the 11th dynasty, Egypt was in decadence. Temples were no longer training places where pupils learned the perception which qualified them to serve the community as priests, but instead were staffed by men who, in spite of their office, were effective only as collectors of tribute. The majority of the population had become so deluded that they even accepted the notion that the gods were so vain and insecure that they depended on audience reaction and relished being worshipped. Ra-Ap-Hotep belonged to a resistance movement which, although vastly outnumbered, contained enough sane individuals to overthrow a rule based on terrorization. They were called the Eyes of Horus, a title they had adopted to remind themselves that the man of true insight must keep both his eyes open. With one he will see the gods, and with the other the maggots in the belly of a dead crocodile. Their password was, send fear into exile. If they had belonged to the present century, they might have taken down with one-upmanship as a slogan, equally urgent and opposite. When the pharaoh they had chosen, Mehmet, was proclaimed, he made a speech to the thousands who had assembled to welcome him, which, although it is too long to quote in full, contains passages which I believe are worth remembering. I shall never forget that day. Mehmet looked remote as a god statue, his face under the white crown calm as the crossed hands which held the crook, with which he had vowed to shepherd his people, and the flail by which he would protect them from their enemies. Yet to each of the multitude who heard his voice he spoke as a friend, and as the link between them and their forerunners. Strive for happiness as lesser men strive for power, and remember that love is both the seed and the flower of joy. Let your actions be such that, if they were done to you, they would increase your happiness. Love others that they may love you, and love yourself that you may love others. This is the first law, the imperishable rock on which the new Egypt must be built. If this law be kept, there will be no need for other laws. Yet, so that you may know that the first law shall give you, I will tell you what harvest will spring from that single furrow if you are wise husbandmen. You will be born without fear, for your mother and your father will rejoice in their fertility. You will learn the speech of kindliness, so that the rasp of anger and the sound, harsh as splintered bones of quarrels, shall be as foreign language with which holds no meaning for you. Your work shall be according to the needs of your soul. Though you were born in the house of a fisherman, you may become a scribe. Though you are born in the house of a potter, you may become a warrior. Or, from the house of a field worker, you may become a noble. You shall be measured according to the weighing of your heart, neither being wearied by a field too large for you to till, nor restricted by boundaries that are too narrow. You are bound to no one save by the gold link of affection. Should brother and brother be kinsmen only by blood, then they will say farewell with the usage of courtesy and take different roads rather than travel together in hostility. Mehmet then reminded them that they must guard themselves against Set, who epitomized the devolutionary aspects of mankind: envy, jealousy, and hatred. You must remember always that Set may come to your door in disguise. He may offer you gold which is not yours by right. He may offer you the rod of authority when you know it is too heavy for your hands. He may offer you the strong wine of flattery, which you know you are not old enough to drink. You must recognize him as your enemy, and if he will not leave you when you bid him go, then you must call upon your friends to help you drive him again into exile. In obeying the first law, you will have broken many of the arrows in Set's quiver. You will not fear solitude, for you will never be friendless. You will not fear your husband or your wife, for you will have taken them in love and not for expediency. You will not fear your child, for no enemy can be born of love. You will not fear idleness, for all are needed in the new Egypt. You will not fear work, for it will be congenial. You will not fear famine, for in the granaries there will be bread for the lean years. You will not fear floods, for the water channels shall be maintained, and the aqueducts mighty in their cupids. You will not fear to grow up, for the years will show you new horizons. You will not fear to grow old, for in each horizon you will find further wisdom. You will not fear death, for you shall remember the other side of the great river. You will not fear Set, but conquer him by the love in your heart. Amma Mehmet's promise to his people came true and endured for more than 3 centuries, until the ethics of which he had reminded them were again forgotten. During that interlude of peace and sanity, I was born, at least twice in the Nile Valley, but both lives were so happy and uneventful that they are a source of nostalgia, but not of a book. These gentle memories make it increasingly difficult to understand why people of our generation do not demand the same quality of insight and integrity from their leaders. If they did so, then the leaders would be able to promise them opportunities more congenial than the prospect of being incarnated in bodies which will be less pretty, less nimble than those they are now using. For evidence suggests that none of the species on this planet will be improved by the mutations caused by radioactivity. Ra'apotep's life was published as Eyes of Horus and Lord of the Horizon in 1942 and 1943. For even after I had cut 5 chapters which concerned his son and were redundant to the autobiography, the recording still ran to over 250,000 words, which was impractical for a single book during the wartime paper restrictions. I also cut 6 traditional stories which had been told to Ra'apotep during his childhood, and which he told to his sons and daughters, but these were spared from the bonfire and became the scarlet fish. Recalling these stories was astoundingly easy, possibly because he had heard them while still young enough to see them as a series of vivid mental images. They may also have been remained so clearly delineated because I had been told them in at least 4 Egyptian childhoods. And to be reminded of something one already knows always makes a more lively impression than the cautious sniff at a new piece of information. I incidentally discovered why I had always been attracted by the blue faience hippopotamuses, which are in nearly every collection of Egyptian antiquities. For they illustrate the story in which a blue faience hippopotamus, who was the toy of a little princess, it's my vocal cat, sorry, she talks a lot. For they illustrate the story in which a blue faience hippopotamus, which was the toy of a little princess, learned to love her so much that a kindly magician turned him into a human being, so he could be born to her and the prince she loved, the prince of whom he had managed never to be jealous. I will now finish this here and do a 3rd reading of this first chapter soon.